Good evening and welcome to this special edition of The Update. Tonight we are doing a full guide to the Iowa Caucus,
including what is a caucus, how to participate in one, and who will be on the ballot.
Also, recent polling numbers, answering questions about the caucus, and the road to the presidential election. I'm Johnny Valtman.
And I'm Jordan Tovar.
And Jordan, starting this one off, not a lot of people know what a caucus is.
And it's such an integral part of the election process. I think it's important that people know more about it.
Yes, and to tell us more about it, we have Cara, who's going to join us and tell people what exactly a caucus is.
Yeah, Johnny, we talk every week about candidates who stopped in Iowa to campaign. Believe it or not, they're not visiting because of our fantastic weather and exotic landscape. No, the reason Iowa sees so many presidential candidates leading up to January is because for a long time, the Iowa Caucus has been thought to play a crucial role in determining each party's presidential nomination. Since the 1970s, primaries and caucuses have been used to increase voter participation and stop small groups of people from having total say over who the state nominates. And starting in the 70s, Iowa began its first in the nation status for both parties, meaning that it was the first state in the country to hold a caucus or primary election. How Iowa ended up first is really kind of by accident. Iowa had one of the longer, more complex processes for presidential nominations, so it had to start earlier. This worked out well enough for Jimmy Carter in 1976, whose Iowa caucus win got him all the way to the White House. After that, the Iowa caucus became a pretty big deal. Or it is primaries, but the main difference is that caucuses are run by parties while primaries are run by the state. Both of these have the same goal of choosing delegates to represent their states at each party's national convention. In Iowa, both the Republican and the Democratic parties caucus, although they each do it differently. Republicans cast their vote in a secret ballot. The results of these are counted and the delegates are divided proportionally to the statewide vote. Meanwhile, this year the Democratic National Committee decided to strip Iowa of its first in the nation status, citing that it did not accurately reflect the nation's demographic and moved to replace it with South Carolina. Because of this, instead of the traditional in-person caucusing, the new Democratic caucus system will involve mail-in ballots. These results will also be divided proportionally among delegates. After all state caucuses and primaries, state delegates will attend their party's national conventions in late summer to confirm their choice of candidate for the 2024 presidential election. Jordan and Johnny, I'll send it back to you.
Thanks, Cara. And Jordan, you know, it's always exciting when the caucus comes around, just like the presidential election and my birthday. It only happens once every 4 years.
Yes, Johnny, but that might not mean that everyone is sure exactly how to vote in a caucus. That's why we have DITV's Jayce Bertrand in the newsroom, where he is going to tell us all the different ways to caucus.
Thanks, Jordan. Now, the caucusing process will look different for voters depending on the party. Because the Democratic Party currently holds the executive branch, they will not be holding in-person caucuses for the presidential election. Instead, mail-in presidential preference ballots can be requested from the Iowa Democrats website. The Democratic caucus on January 15th will not be for the presidential election. These in-person votes will instead be focused on electing delegates and committee members for future conventions. The presidential preference cards will be collected on February 19th, 2024, and results will be released on March 5th, 2024, ahead of the Democratic primary. As for the Republican caucus, votes will be held in person. Polling locations will be released by the Iowa Republican Party closer to the date of the caucus. And in-person voting begins on January 15th at 7 p.m. Back to Johnny and Jordan in the studio.
Thanks, Jayce. Now, Johnny, since we know when we're voting, I'm just curious, who's all running this year?
Yes, Jordan, we got a lot of different candidates from both sides, and voters, they will have a wide selection. The in-person Republican caucus will have 7 names at the time of recording on the ballot. The former President Donald Trump, Florida Governor Ron DeSantis, former UN Ambassador Nikki Haley, tech entrepreneur Vivek Ramaswamy, and former Governor of New Jersey Chris Christie will be the notable names on the ballot. Other Republican longshots will include businessman Ryan Binkley and former Arkansas Governor Asa Hutchinson. The following candidates will not be included on the ballot after dropping out of the race. Former Vice President Mike Pence, Governor of South Carolina Tim Scott, and recently North Dakota Governor Doug Burgum will be absent from the ballots. On January 15th, the Democrats will instead be voting to elect delegates for future conventions rather than voting to determine a presidential candidate. Instead, the Iowa Democratic Party will be sending out presidential preference cards where voters can express who they wish to see on their ballot in November. Iowa Democrats will have a much smaller pool to choose from, as President Joe Biden's name will appear with author Marianne N. Williamson and Minnesota Representative Dean Phillips. Now, if a candidate who is on the ballot drops out, their name will not appear on the ballot, for they're no longer running for president. And Jordan, with these candidates now established, you have some numbers you'd like to share with us.
Yeah, and with every election season, polls are often at the forefront of political coverage, and this year is no different. Thanks, Jayce. Now, Johnny, since we know when we're voting, I'm just curious, who's all running this year?
Yes, Jordan, we got a lot of different candidates from both sides, and voters, they will have a wide selection. The in-person Republican caucus will have 7 names at the time of recording on the ballot. The former President Donald Trump, Florida Governor Ron DeSantis, former UN Ambassador Nikki Haley, tech entrepreneur Vivek Ramaswamy, and former Governor of New Jersey Chris Christie will be the notable names on the ballot. Other Republican long shots will include businessman Ryan Binkley and former Arkansas Governor Asa Hutchinson. The following candidates will not be included on the ballot after dropping out of the race. Former Vice President Mike Pence, Governor of South Carolina Tim Scott, and recently North Dakota Governor Doug Burgum will be absent from the ballots. On January 15th, the Democrats will instead be voting to elect delegates for future conventions rather than voting to determine a presidential candidate. Instead, the Iowa Democratic Party will be sending out presidential preference cards where voters can express who they wish to see on their ballot in November. Iowa Democrats will have a much smaller pool to choose from, as President Joe Biden's name will appear with author Marianne N. Williamson and Minnesota Representative Dean Phillips. Now, if a candidate who is on the ballot drops out, their name will not appear on the ballot, for they're no longer running for president. Now, Jordan, now that we know who all is running, there's been polls going on since the start of this, and you've got some numbers you'd like to share with us.
Yeah, and with every election season, polls are often at the forefront of political coverage, and this year is no different. However, in elections since 1998, polls have only been accurate 78% of the time. We're going to look at a couple different sources that have taken polls throughout this cycle, and the ones in particular that we'll be looking at are stats website 538, which is owned by ABC, and Iowa newspaper The Des Moines Register. Something that both of these polls agree on is that former President Donald Trump is still the clear favorite to win Iowa. And rounding out the top 3 in both are Florida Governor Ron DeSantis and former UN Ambassador Nikki Haley and tech entrepreneur Vivek Ramaswamy, sitting in a distant 4th place in each. As of late, Haley has seen her numbers steadily rise to close the 2nd place gap that has been held by DeSantis for most of the caucus cycle. However, in 538's poll, DeSantis is currently edging Haley by 2 percentage points. DeSantis holds 17.7% of the vote, with Haley holding 15%. Trump has an overwhelming amount of support compared to the other two, with 44.6%. The Des Moines Register poll tells a little bit different of a story. It's still only a little different, however, as Trump is still blowing the other candidates out of the water with 43%. In this one, however, DeSantis and Haley sit in a deadlock at 16% each. These polls will continue to be updated until the caucus, but there seems to be a common theme based off of all of them, with Trump as the projected frontrunner. Things can always change between now and the caucus, as you all know, however. And Johnny, with all this going on, I'm sure people have a lot of questions about caucusing.
Yes, Jordan, and before I did a little bit more research, I myself even had some questions about the caucuses, and that's why we're going to bring it back into Jayce, who is in the newsroom, and he's going to be answering some common questions voters may have. And Jayce, to start off, are voters able to participate in both of these caucuses?
Unfortunately, no, Johnny. Both the Democrats and Republicans are hosting closed primaries this year. This means that you have to be a registered member with the party to participate in the caucus. Democratic voters can register online on the Iowa Democrats website, while the Republican voters can either register online or in person at a polling location, as long as they provide a valid form of ID and proof of Iowa residence.
And with that, Jayce, who is all able to caucus?
Any Iowa resident over the age of 18 registered to vote can register to caucus. When you caucus, be sure to bring a valid form of ID to the in-person polling locations.
With that, are people able to observe polling locations even though they may not be voting?
Yes, anyone interested in observing can do so if they please, though be sure to reach out to polling locations to make sure there's room to observe.
And one last question, Jayce. How long should people expect the caucus to last?
Well, Jordan, lines for caucusing usually seem longer than they actually are. However, these lines tend to move incredibly fast, so be sure not to get out of line so as to not lose your spot. And those are some of the most common questions revolving around caucusing. If you have any questions, the Iowa Democratic Party and the Iowa Republican Party, their websites have a lot of information as well.
Thanks, Jayce. And Jordan, the Iowa Caucus is just one piece of a massive puzzle into figuring out who the next president's going to be.
And it's just one step of the way until the November 2024 election, and we're going to send it back to Cara, who has up until the Iowa Caucus and beyond.
Thanks, Jordan. Before we even get to the caucuses, we've got one more Republican debate coming up. The fourth Republican debate will take place Thursday in Tuscaloosa, Alabama on News Nation. Only 4 Republican candidates will attend, meaning the stage has been cut in half since the first one in August. Ron DeSantis, Nikki Haley, Vivek Ramaswamy, and Chris Christie will debate and make their final arguments before Iowans make their way to the caucus. Then the Iowa Caucus will occur on January 15th, which will give the state and the rest of America the Republican frontrunner. Meanwhile, because Iowa no longer has its first-in-the-nation status for the Democratic Party, those results will not be announced until Super Tuesday on March 5th, which is when several states will hold their primaries or caucuses. A week after the Iowa caucus, New Hampshire will hold its presidential primary, followed by Nevada on February 6th for Democrats and the 8th for Republicans. The caucuses and primaries are just one early step in determining who the next president of the United States will be, though. After these are complete, state delegates will attend each party's national convention to endorse the state's chosen candidates. At the national conventions, a candidate has to win the majority number of delegates to become the party's final presidential candidate. The presidential candidates are officially announced at the end of the conventions, which is also when the candidate will announce who will run with them for vice president. For this election, the Republicans will hold their convention first, since Democrats currently hold the White House. The Republican National Convention will take place from July 15th to the 18th, and the Democratic National Convention will take place from August 19th to the 22nd. After that, it's all about campaigns and debates. Leading up to Election Day, there will be 3 presidential debates and 1 vice presidential debate. Presidential debates will take place on September 16th, October 1st, and October 9th, and the vice presidential debate is slated for September 25th. Finally, every step of this long process leads to Election Day on November 5th, 2024. After votes are counted and the winner is announced, the new president will be inaugurated on January 20th, 2025. Jordan and Johnny, back to you.
Thanks, Cara. You know, Johnny, with all this information, there's got to be some sort of importance to it.
Yes, Jordan, and to Iowans, it just means something different to them. As Cara said earlier, there's a reason all these candidates have come to the pizza ranches and small mom-and-pop shops in the cities throughout Iowa. Iowa holds the first in-person Republican caucus, which sets the tone of the presidential race. While Democrats have a sitting president, the preference cards can show that the Democrats may want another leader of their party, while the Republican caucus could show the split in the party over the former president. Since the 1976 election, Iowa has been good at picking the eventual party candidate. 7 out of the 12 Republican candidates who ended up winning the party's nomination topped the Iowa caucus. Democrats got an extra, as Iowa voters favored the eventual nominee 8 out of 12 times for the Democrats. Overall, 6 presidential winners topped Iowa's caucus and would win the presidency. Something to think about too is, up until recently, Iowa has been seen as a swing state during elections. Republican and Democrat nominees would have to fight tooth and nail to secure Iowa's 5 electoral votes, which are vital to a potential presidency. While Iowa may be a little bit more red now, I still feel this state represents a wide variety of people from both sides of the aisle. While most of America may attack Iowa for being a barren farmland with nothing to do, we play a pivotal part in electing the next president, and caucusing is vital to helping Iowa stay on the presidential map. No matter who you're leaning for on either side, I highly encourage all of age to caucus and play an important role of choosing the next president. And with that, we would like to thank you for tuning into this special edition of The Update tonight, where you'll find everything you need to know about the Iowa caucuses.
With finals, then winter break coming up, we will be back in January for all your caucus results.
From The Update, I'm Johnny Valtman.
And I'm Jordan Tovar. Have a wonderful Christmas and a Happy New Year.